Okay, so yeah, thanks, Mary. I'm excited to have this conversation because yeah, I mean, I think I seem to think there's like more people talking about this topic now. It seems like I think more people are discussing Blanchardianism. It seems to be like increasingly less of a niche thing. I see it sort of like escaping into more like mainstream conversations. But I don't know if you have that similar perception. But the reason why I wanted to reach out to you and have this conversation was because you did a video reacting to one of my videos where I was sort of defending the sort of two type claim, which is I think that the thing about the theory that gets the most criticism is the claim that there's just two types of trans women. And I think
Yeah.
there's just like kind of like a knee-jerk reaction to like, well, it can't be that simple. That's too simplistic.
Yeah, I think that's sort of like the knee-jerk reaction to the term itself in a way. I think where it's got the
Like
philia part of it, maybe that's what people kind of react to straight away, is in, oh, I have a fetish, you know?
yeah, well, I think that is indeed like yeah, there's definitely like a marketing issue with the
Yeah.
term because but I think Phil Illy has actually done a really good job of providing a a useful alternative. You know, the concept of auto heterosexuality as opposed to
Yeah.
auto kind of affiliate. Like it's more generic. I mean, I do think AGP versus AAP is like useful terminology once you sort of drill down into like male specific versus female specific like manifestations
Yeah.
of like that phenomenon. But yeah, I mean, I do think people just like the term autogynephilia, just like it just sort of feels gross to people to say it. I think there's like
Yeah.
there's like a squick factor. I don't know if that's like inherent to any term that has the term philia in it, or if it's just like
I think
been
I think it's partly
yeah.
that. Like for me, I was introduced to it through ContraPoints. Like I was a huge ContraPoints watcher. What would this have been? 2018, 2019? So that was like my first kind of real introduction to it.
Yeah. I mean, I remember reading Julia Serrano's Whipping Girl
Mm-hmm.
early into my transition, and she was like a huge influence on me, and like she had several essays in there, sort of critiquing Blanchard's. That was probably my first introduction. But yeah, I do remember watching that like ContraPoints video and like being super impressed by ContraPoints' like argumentation, and I was like, oh yeah, this is like total debunking. You know,
Yeah.
there's absolutely no merit to this. And in my own book, like I had several essays also critiquing the theory. So like I'm
Oh
like
wow.
on record, you know, like finding flaws in it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the first thing is like I think one in your video, there's like one issue which is like the theory is never going to work because trans women themselves aren't going to self-ascribe to it. That was sort of like
Yeah.
one of your criticisms. Like, what's the point of this theory if like the people being described by the theory like aren't ever going to like feel comfortable saying like, yes,
Yeah.
this like describes me.
I
Like,
guess I'd ask it in a way that's like, is it necessary for them to be comfortable with it in order for it to be like valid? Which I guess they don't technically have to be.
yeah, I mean, this is where you get into, you know, sort of questions like, what? Okay, so this is like a psychological theory. Okay, well, what's like the purpose of developing psychological theories? Like, one might say, like, well, we're just interested in the truth, and this seems to be like a true theory. But you know, there's definitely like ways to be more like pragmatic. It's like, okay, well, you know, there's like a million things that you could research in the sciences. Why are you interested in like this particular research question? Like what purpose does objective knowledge about this topic like serve? Does it, you know, provide better clinical management? Does it, you know, help people in like gender clinics more? Does it help people with self knowledge? Like, I guess that might be one criticism of like what's like the purpose of the theory.
Yeah.
But I'm like kind of resistant to that just because like I feel like there's intrinsic value in truth. So like,
Well, the
you
other
know,
side of
regardless.
it, there's an automatic resistance to a lot of that in trans circles, I think. Like, we don't want to discover the truth about something unless it's affirming in some way. I feel like that's how it tends to be, like, worded and, like, presented almost.
Right. I mean, yeah, I think there's a strong like well, there's like two components. There's like a sort of the sort of pragmatism, which is like asking questions like, okay, well, what's the purpose of this research? And then there's like the communitarianism of like, okay, well, our number one priority is to protect the trans community. And we have to protect these political rights. For example, like, you know, they think that if the public got wind of this theory, it would sort of erode the political will of the people to provide, legal access to like, hormones or something like this. That's sort of the worry is like, if this knowledge gets out, then, it'll like take away, access to healthcare or something like
Yeah.
this,
So it's
which
more that than like a backlash or a reaction from people being like, oh, you people are just fetishists. Like, it's more that it might sort of demedicalize it in a way.
yeah, but I also think there's like a big like risk for that strategy backfiring because to people who are not in the ideological bubble of the trans world, who aren't scared to call out these behaviors, it seems obvious to people that AGP exists.
Yeah.
So I think the trans community does itself a disservice because there's numerous viral social media examples of people who clearly seem to be showcasing some like deviance in their sexual behavior, or it's sort of like just obvious to people that that's like what's going on. And so I think there's like a risk to like make yourself as a community look bad because you're sort of denying the obvious, and then that
Yeah.
gets into like this criticism of like, oh well, you guys are just ignoring the truth, and that's like a typical like politically correct move, and it's
Yeah.
just
Because I mean,
weak.
we're not shy of like seeming to not understand basic truths. Like, a lot of the trans kind of perspective seems to come from women pretending that sex doesn't exist and then just kind of, well, what now? And it's like, well, sex does exist, so it's kind of there's already a huge hole in this entire premise. But that's what it feels like
Right.
a lot of the time. We're just pretending it doesn't exist or deciding it can be contravened by like a gender identity.
Right. And then so I think there's increasingly more and more people, I think, for example, like Brianna Wu seems to
Mm-hmm.
like have recently said that like it's real, it exists, AGP is real. And then there's like this sort of the additional claim, which is I think the more controversial one theoretically, which is that there's just the two types, going back to like that claim, like there's just two types of trans women. And I recently like made a post on Twitter about the two typeism and
Yeah.
like the strong claim, and like Ray Blanchard actually like he like responded to that, and he said he like showed some quote from some old research paper saying that like you know there might be a third type. So it's not like he's like skeptical that there might ever be a third type.
Yeah.
I think it's more just like we like know the AGP type exists. We know that HSTS type exists. And then there seems to be some evidence showing that the majority of male to female transsexualism is of the AGP type. And then whether there's like a third type that's undiscovered or some, and that's probably would be in like these bisexual and asexual cases where
Yeah.
there's maybe like an overlap in the behavior or it doesn't fit the pattern or the and so there's that question of like, okay, well maybe the two type typology, maybe it's three types, maybe there's four types, but it seems like at that point like yeah, it seems like we're just doing science, and which in terms of just like discovering more knowledge, and it's not like challenging the basic premise,
Yeah.
which I thinking more about like this phenomenon exists.
Yeah. I mean, usually you can do science and it's not like a huge problem for a supposed entire demographic, I guess.
Right. Um, so one of the things that you mentioned in your video is that like you're just like skeptical of the strong two type
Mhm.
claim because you just feel like there's too many counterexamples. Like you said, yourself, you feel like you don't fit into the typology.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I do, to be clear. If someone proves that I am an AGP tomorrow or something, it's not the end of the world to me. I don't really care that much, but like,
Well, that's sort of the
yeah,
question. Okay, so how do you prove it? So if you want to establish that there's not two types, okay, so you have to like provide evidence that there's a third type. And usually the best way to do that is to just, you know, to prove the falsehood of the claim that there's only two of something. The only way to do that is like you just have to prove a third type exists.
yeah,
And so people will just say like, well, my own experience is proof of that because I don't fit into this pattern. And so it seems very easy to like establish that there's like at least a third type. And then of course the rejoinder from the Blanchardians is like, well, they're just lying about their experiences. And so then the question is like, okay, so um, how do you sort of arbitrate that debate? You know, it seems like we're gonna get like hit like a dead end somehow, where it's like,
yeah. Well, I
you
mean, we
know,
have in so many areas, right? I mean, what the people on one side want and what the people on the other side want are at complete stalemate a lot of the time. And like,
right?
I guess sorry, I had something I was gonna say and I've completely forgotten. I do that a
Yeah.
lot.
Um, well,
Yeah, I'll
I
come back.
mean, like, so take the claim that it's like, I think you'll often see like the more asexual folks who don't have this, you know, strong erotic masturbatory life, that they don't have this sort of fetishistic interest in like transvestism, for example, that is like sort of become stereotyped as like classical autogynephilia. And so it's like,
Yeah,
well, you know, my past, my history doesn't have that sort of like fetishistic behavior in it, but I'm attracted to women, or I have some degree of gynephilia. So therefore, I'm like a counterexample to the theory. And I think this is where I think, you know, Phil Illy's formulation of this as a sort of inverted form of of heterosexuality is like the key theoretical principle, and realizing that like that key underlying disposition of having this inversion of your sexuality, that disposition in and of itself, of that inverted sexuality, in some cases that leads to the fetishistic behavior. In some cases it leads to, you know, people who are totally asexual, who don't have, you know, that much attraction to other people, and their sexuality is just like having an elaborate imaginative fantasy life, for example.
yeah,
Like it's not like, you know, elaborate masturbation or something. And then there's like a whole degree of in between. So I think like that's the way I think about it, is like, so I don't think the key theory is like, oh well, everyone starts off as like a fetish. It's more like the like fetish is just like one possible manifestation of that underlying
yeah,
inversion. And I think that's the real weakness of the theory, is like, well, no one really knows what it means to have an inverted sexuality. We
yeah,
just like just say that, but at the end of the day it's like, you know, that's just like a psychological postulation,
yeah.
of, you know, it's not like hard science or anything.
Yeah, of course. One thing I wanted to come back to, sorry, I did remember kind of what I was saying, but like I think that the kind of unfalsifiable nature of like AGP kind of mirrors how unfalsifiable like all of it is, in that we're going on people's experiences and the main clash is whether you believe someone or not. And it's very
Right.
hard because anyone can say anything. I can say anything I want about my past. If I decide that autogynephilia is like stigmatizing and I want to prove it wrong, I don't have to be honest to like do that, but then I'm still not really proving it wrong. I'm just saying a bunch of stuff, I guess, which is kind of what
Right.
ContraPoints did in her video.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this issue of like retconning the history. I
Yeah.
mean, I think there's a couple of ways of like getting an angle on that, which is like the like one way is just like, outside of this particular domain, we know that our episodic memories, like our memories about our past, like filtered through this autobiographical lens. Like we already
Yeah.
know from like previous research that like that process of remembering episodes in our past life, we already know that that is a constructive process.
Yeah.
Like there's been a number of research showing that like in general, whenever we reflect on the past, like we construct those memories like anew. And there's also been evidence that like that process can involve confabulation. And we also know from like repressed memory studies that people can just totally make up memories. So we already have like a
Yeah.
precedent theoretically that like it's possible that retconning of one's past is possible. And then I think Blanchard had some research where this was like the main research that he used to sort of provide evidence for his retconning argument, which is that he asked some trans women, like, have you ever shown arousal to the thought of cross-dressing or something? And they were like, no. That's what they said. But then you hook them up to like a penis device or whatever, and then you have them read stories of like literotica of like cross-dressing, and then they get aroused. So it's like there seems to be a disconnect between saying something that's socially acceptable, or like doing it because there's a social motivation to say what's like acceptable, versus like unconsciously what's like happening. So I mean, I think that's like, I don't think that's like definitive or like it doesn't prove anything, but it's like it is like suggestive.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I don't know, with trans stuff, I think the only real indicator as to how truthful someone's being is how, like, committed they are to it. Like, if you see someone who just looks like yourself but is saying they're a trans woman still, people aren't going to believe them really because they just look like a guy, Whereas someone who's been doing it for a lot of time and has been dressing a certain way for years, that's kind of the only way we can even begin to, like, tell who's, like, being real and who isn't. And even then, it's not a very good indicator, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the sincerity of one's transition is, yeah, I don't feel like that's like um really does anything theoretically. It doesn't like
Yeah.
provide any additional like weight or like argument. But yeah, I mean, so going back to like the claim of the typology, like I don't think the theory hangs on there only being two types. I think what I've heard people like Michael Bailey or Ray Blanchard said is like, well, is there evidence of a third type? Because there does seem to be strong evidence for the two types that they exist. We all seem to be aware, and we can point out examples, and it's been studied. And the question is like, okay, well, suppose there's like another pathway into trans identification. They postulate this like ROGD boy thing or whatever. And this, let's say like, well, it's usually these like, young, maybe like Asperger's are on the spectrum, and, they're, maybe delayed sexual development of some kind. And, they're very nerdy, high intelligence, very sensitive. They don't have like elaborate sexual libidos or anything like this. And so like, is that a third type, or is that just another way AGP manifest? And
Yeah, I mean, you
I,
could.
I don't know. Like,
There's all sorts of places. I guess you could look for like the beginnings of a third type. Like, I don't know. I don't know how much like stuff like autism is considered by someone like Blanchard, whether it's like really relevant or not.
I don't think I'm not aware of like Blanchard really like saying too much about autism,
Yeah.
but to me, there's like a clear connection, because like it seems like the non-autistic AGPs are few and far between.
Oh, right, right.
Like, and like my experience, like
Yeah.
I feel like I'm one of the rare non-autistic like
Fair enough.
AGPs, but I am I feel like I have like some degree of neurodivergence or
Yeah, I'm
some
sure everyone does. You know?
some atypicality, and then it's like, okay, well, what does it even mean to be like
Yeah.
atypical with your brain? There's lots of ways to be atypical with your brain.
True. Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, I was going to ask whether you think it kind of correlates much, but I guess you think it does.
Oh
With
yeah, I
like
mean,
AGPs
definitely.
and yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of the like stereotypes, for example, like all the stereotypes about AGPs being like, computer programmers and stuff like this. That I think that's just like a straightforward like derivative of the correlation with like the more autistic archetype. But yeah, and in terms of like, well, why is that? Like, what's the explanation? I don't think anyone really knows. I've heard Phil Illy say something like autism involves differences in like self-processing. So like how you process information about yourself. Like there's like a greater depth to that self-processing, like the layers of like in the neural net. It's like it just goes deeper and the layers of processing. And then AGP also seems to involve like self-processing in some way. So like that to me is like the connection, but like that's all I got.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah.
One thing I wonder about a lot, and this might be a bit off topic, people kind of suggest that, someone like Blanchard is suggesting they know that person better than they know themselves. But like to me, it kind of seems like people don't know themselves as well as they think they do. But it's the
Yeah.
kind of thing I have no idea how to even begin like conveying that to someone, because I feel like if you tell someone that, they'll have the same reaction of like, how can you think you know me better than I do?
Right. I mean, this is just one of those like things that's tricky. And yeah, I mean, maybe this is going back to that question of like, can a theory of psychology ever take off without that subjective like affirmation from the people meant to be described by the theory, saying like,
Yeah.
yes, this describes me? Because I think that's the reason why AGP kind of is still around as like a theoretical thing, is because Anne Lawrence wrote the book where like you had all these like you know transsexuals who self-identify with the theory and say like, yes, this theory describes my life. And then similarly, there's like the Ask AGP subreddit, which is like I don't know, it's like up to like 5,000
Oh
people,
wow.
and it's like 5,000 people who all I'm sure not everyone who
Give or
subscribes to
take.
such
Yeah.
such a, but that's like thousands of people who are saying like this theory it is accurately describing my life to some degree or another. And then there's like a whole universe of like experiences that map onto the theory, but don't but they're not necessarily like self-aware of that. For example,
Yeah.
like there's all these sissy subreddits on like on like Reddit, and it's like, yeah, obviously all this like falls under the like rubric of the AGB theory. They're just not like aware of the obscure psychology theory that describes their experience, but it's
Yeah.
like um but yeah, and then there's like also a lot of evidence showing that there's like that pipeline between the sissy world and then the trans world,
Yeah. Yeah.
because you have people who are currently identifying as trans say like, oh yeah, I used to identify as a sissy, and then you have the sissies who are like, oh yeah, I'm thinking of transitioning. And so
Yeah.
it's
I think
like
pre-trans
you
me
have
is
you have
exactly the same.
you have it like from like both directions, and then and then every single one of these like gender dysphoria resources, like the gender dysphoria Bible and all these things on the internet, or in like and all these medium essays or blogs that get promulgated around the like internet and Reddit and Discord for like cracking eggs. And one of the most common questions is like, is it just a fetish? And so it seems very common for people to explore their sexuality, and even people like Julie Serrano, they like agree with that premise. They just think that like the repressed gender identity is what's causing the exploration of gender through the outlet of kink, but they don't deny that like exploration through the outlet of kink is the primary method of like gender exploration for the majority of like trans feminine people. The question is like, okay, well, what's the ultimate explanation for why they're exploring it through kink?
Yeah, when
And
you
the
say
gender.
kink, sorry.
I mean, when I mean kink, I mean typically it's like, I mean, there's like a wide variety of ways. I mean, for some, the kink is like transvestic cross dressing. For some, the kink is like reading gender swap erotica. For some, it's they can't get off unless they imagine themselves with a vagina.
Oh
For like
yeah.
it like depends on the type. There's like the transvestic types, there's the anatomical types, there's so depending on what type you are, like the kink is going to manifest in a variety of different ways.
Yeah.
And I
So
think that's where people get confused, is because people associate it with the transvestism,
yeah.
but it goes beyond that for sure.
And when you say kink, it's not necessarily like the way someone would say kinky. It's just literally what you're kind of into. It's not
Yeah,
necessarily
exactly.
I'm into BDSM and that's why I'm, that kind of
Right.
thing.
It's just like what like the like way I think about it is like, um what is the primary thing that gets you going sexually?
Yeah.
Like, because there's some things that's just like, you know, it like ramps them up sexually more than anything else. And like that, I think is like how we get a grip on what is your primary sexual orientation.
Yeah.
It's like, and I think that's where a lot of this debate, I saw one comment, this comment here. Why do you want to destigmatize AGP by reframing it as an inverted heterosexuality? AGP is an inherently misogynistic fetish. See, this is like, I mean, it's not that I want to destigmatize it. It's just that I think that's the truth. That's what it is. So I think it is
Yeah. So
inverted heterosexuality.
people assume your motivations by being like, well, why are you defending this? And it's like, well, that wasn't what I came in here to do,
Right. And
that
then
kind
they
of
did
thing.
that AJP is like inherently misogynistic. I think it just doesn't get the psychology right. Like these AGPs, like most of them are like the biggest simps in the entire world. Like they love women. They
Yeah.
like they love women more than anything else, and like they like worship women. Women, they put women on a pedestal. That's why they want to be women, is because they love them so much.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think misogyny is not the accurate, the whole like turf theory that these are all just like, man hating, you know I don't know.
Yeah. Because I mean, calling it misogynist, I mean, I don't know. I don't know where you'd even get that from. Like, you like something so much you want to be something. And like even the stereotype stuff, like it's irritating when you listen to 4 or 5 trans people in a row saying, "Oh, I wanted to be female so that I could wear pigtails." But at the same time, like if I was asked like what my womanhood consists of, I have no idea. Like
Right.
most of my look is like, for any trans person, I think it is kind of imitation, and it's something we could probably do well to sort of admit, because you have to look at women and like, what do they wear, how do they present themselves when you're trying to work your own look out, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think with the AGP stuff, the option is like, well, if you look at how they dress, they're sort of like the classical archetype, the fishnets and the high heels and the short leather skirt and sort of like wearing lingerie. And it's very sort of like stereotyped. It's like I don't know. And so it's like, well, like you are deriving your conception of what it is to be a woman from like, porn and like all this stuff. So that's why it's misogynistic. I mean, it's
Yeah.
going back to kind of like the classic Janice Raymond, like all trans women, are, they like grape people by it's sort of like the very desire to like embody the female form is like seen as like misogynistic or something, which I don't buy
Yeah,
that.
it gets a bit
Like,
kind of abstract, because I felt
yeah.
like I watched Julia Serrano actually talk about AGP in like 2009 or something. This was like literally yesterday. I found it on YouTube, and it seemed like a very feminist kind of reading of that, sort of talking about pathologizing certain like aspects of womanhood, I think, towards the end.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, but I wanted to go back to like one of your criticisms of the theory,
Mm,
which is that like people just aren't going to self-ascribe to this. Like and I think you may have just been um, being a little like hyperbolic or
maybe.
you were saying something like no one's going to want to say that they transition just to fuck themselves. So it's like, but I think this is part of the problem is like the way it's been characterized for so long by both the TRAs and the TERFs. Yeah, of course, people aren't going to self ascribe to the theory when it becomes caricatured. And like,
Yeah.
yeah, and like no one wants to say that the entirety of their motivations for doing this big complicated social thing that they come out at work and it impacts your entire life.
Yeah.
You don't want your work colleagues, it's like not like you can post on your LinkedIn national coming out day in my LinkedIn. I'm an autogynephile. It's
Yeah, of
like
course.
that's probably not gonna happen. So like
Yeah.
I feel like that's why the gender identity framework has become so dominant is just because it provides a social script that you can use in these like scenarios, like at work and talking to your parents or like
Yeah.
any sort of situation.
It kind of feels like we're using like metaphorical language from about 5 years ago, but like literally nowadays. Like when I was starting my transition, if I was to say something like I identify as a woman, I don't actually know what that means to do. I don't think anyone does. Or like I feel like I was born in the wrong body. I wasn't actually born in the wrong body. But it's like we use these terms like fact now. Like that's actually how it works. Like my male body should be my condition because I'm actually a female or something.
Right.
But it feels like we've taken it like so far. And like when I watched the ContraPoints video, and in fact with her kind of videos when she was criticizing those kind of things in general, all she was really doing differently was just kind of admitting to certain things that yeah, she's a male and stuff like that, you know? That's the
Right.
main difference.
Yeah, and I think if I recall correctly from that ContraPoints video, her like criticism was essentially, oh, this Blanchard stuff, it's pseudoscientific, blah blah blah, and the actual, the the professional medical consensus is that transgender identity is caused by gender dysphoria. Oh, but for a supposed critical thinker, she didn't ask the question. Okay, well, where does gender dysphoria come from, and like
Yeah.
why does it seem to show up in these different patterns? Because she admitted at the beginning, she was like, "Oh yeah, there's these two clusters, cluster A, cluster B." And upon first reflection, she's like, "Oh yeah, like I can slot all my friends into this like cluster." But then she's just like, "Oh yeah, well, like, I thought of some counterexamples." Well, just because there's a handful of counterexamples doesn't negate the original observation that like yes, things do tend to fall into these patterns. And the question is like, okay, well, why is that?
Yeah.
Like because it seems like just to say that gender dysphoria is caused by, and the like only alternative theory is that it's like this brain mismatch theory, where it's like the somehow these sexually dimorphic areas of the brain are like female shifted, and
Yeah.
that female shift was what explains this incongruence. But yeah, I just don't feel like there's enough evidence for that theory.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I've seen a bit and it's I mean, a lot of people say that human brains like vary so much anyway, so it's kind of hard to take much from it, I guess. But
right, yeah. I mean, the idea that there's like female versus male brains, I mean, theoretically it's not that clean. Like it's more like there's like these mosaic of overlapping patterns of like
yeah.
dimorphism, and some areas are more dimorphic than others, and some areas like structurally they're the same. The only difference is like the male brains are bigger, so there's more volume, so there's like a sex difference, but it's a difference in like volume because males on general are just larger, so they have larger brains on average. But just because it's like a larger volume doesn't mean it's like at the computational level it's like computing difference. But then again, like neuroscience is like in its infancy, so maybe volumetric differences or could have some functional degree of change. But I mean, no one really knows. I feel like but to rest like the entire like theory, and I think that was the other thing with ContraPoint. Sort of like was like, well, why do we need this theory? It's like what's like the point of this of this theory? Do we need to know where gender dysphoria comes from in order to treat it, for example? And I would say yes. I do think knowing where gender dysphoria comes from is like helpful for its clinical management because,
Yeah.
for example, in like the female case, like if you knew that there's a social contagion element to one's gender dysphoria and you explored that therapeutically, then that might be clinically relevant information, that might impact, whether you want to get some irreversible surgery as a minor or something.
Yeah, because it doesn't get taken very seriously, it feels like, on the trans side. The fact that you can make that kind of decision that you might be 12 years old and then by 22 you might be like infertile or no longer able to breastfeed. And like who knows how you're going to feel about that when you're like 27. Maybe you wanted kids, maybe you wanted to breastfeed and so on.
Right. Well, I think the criticism I always see from the trans community in regards to that concern of like is like one, it's like, well, you know, the LGBT community, we don't care about the heteronormative imperative to procreate or whatever. That's that like norm that it's good to have the option to procreate is like a holdover from heteronormative society or something, and you can't take that to be like a normative good in and of itself or something. And you sort of
Yeah.
just get into these sort of like very anti-teleological positions where like there's no purpose to like having a body. We're just like these lumps of flesh, and
Or you're just your
what
consciousness driving a meat suit around and stuff.
yeah, and it's
Yeah.
like whether the meat suit procreates or not, it's like irrelevant. So they say like, oh yeah, and same thing with like puberty. It's like puberty is not like inherently good or bad to go through because that depends on cis-normative concepts of health or something, and you can't assume that or something.
Yeah. But like surely the human race is like cis normative.
Well, this goes into like where do the norms come from?
Yeah.
Because they'll say like, well, if you're trying to drive them evolution doesn't care, whether we procreate. It's just like a blind, random process, and there's no normativity at all to anything, and
Yeah. It just so
it
happens to keep happening a certain way.
yeah, exactly. It's just like a blind mechanical process. So ultimately, we're free to choose our own meaning, and this is where you get into like transhumanism and
Yeah. Which I mean,
say like
we're a bit past the need to procreate to keep the human race going, I guess. So I get it. I
yeah.
do kind of wonder if as a consequence of that we have a lot more time to think about stuff. But
Yeah, I mean, this is where like the trans movement is. There are a lot of parallels with like the transhumanist movement, and a
yeah.
lot of people have like explicitly made that connection. And within the trans community, a lot of people say like, yeah, that's a good thing. That is like the logical step for humanity to like go down philosophically. I've seen like a lot of people in the trans community seem to lean towards these sort of like sci-fi
Yeah.
transhumanistic. We're gonna be cyborgs and upload our brains into like the digital world, and our fleshly prisons of our bodies are no longer gonna be relevant, and all of our reproduction will be done by like artificial womb. So like rearranging society by our gametes and our reproductive capabilities will be like archaic and all this stuff. And of course the like conservatives are like, see, they're trying to destroy society. um and like
Yeah.
I'm sympathetic to that critique, but philosophically, I mean, I do think there's like some merit to like transhumanism.
Yeah, it's interesting, I guess. Like I watched something. This sounds wacky because it is wacky. I watched something about like womb transplants and someone sort of proclaiming that they might be about 20 years off, as in womb transplants to a trans woman. And like, fuck, where's I going with this? To me, like the immediate feeling I had was like, are we just trying to like replace women at this point? I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I've always found that argument weird. Is like, we say, like, well, if you say that women are defined by being female and being female is defined by your ability to like, to carry babies or
Yeah,
to, give
large
birth to
gap maybe.
children.
Yeah,
Yeah. So it's like, well, okay. So, but technologically, it's possible for, a trans woman to have a womb implanted. So therefore, are the TERFs going to sort of admit that, okay, well, the trans woman gave birth to a baby, are they now female? And I think even in that thought experiment, like, the like turf position is not going to concede that point, because the relevant point is that if you're a 45-year-old male and you spent your entire life developing down a certain developmental trajectory, and your sort of body's been organized for 45 years around a certain trajectory, and then after the fact you took a womb that was grown in a lab and you put it in your body, it doesn't change that history of development,
yeah. You'd need to have been
as
on
as
puberty
as like,
blockers
right.
because
and
your
and
hips won't
and
form the right way.
right, so it's not merely the function of like giving birth. It's like, what's the developmental trajectory of the physiological mechanisms organizing your body around a certain developmental pathway. So it's very much like a development focused perspective, where it's like, how do these body parts arrange themselves over time, through that development process. And so in that sense, they're just like, oh yeah, you have a womb, that doesn't make you female, because being female is about this development
Yeah,
process.
socialization as well and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I find all that stuff quite interesting. Like, I've had a lot of people tell me that males and females aren't socialized any different. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's like crazy to me.
Mm.
Like, I mean, yeah, I don't know if it's, I think people who say that, maybe they're slightly autistic and may not be aware of like the social
Yeah.
nuances or something. It's
Or like
just like,
what I find, especially with like FTMs for some reason, is they'll tend to sort of criticize the way that men socialize with each other, as if there's like something wrong with them. When
right,
when I hear a criticism like that, my kind of immediate thought is like, having lived as a guy for however long, it's like that's just what guys are like, there's nothing wrong with that.
right,
And someone's like shitting on them for being awkward or something. That seems a bit kind of ignorant to me because they haven't grown up as a guy.
right. And on the flip side, on the M to F side, the like argument I always hear about, like, why trans women don't have male socialization, is because they'll say like, well, I was exposed to the same socialization, but I didn't internalize it the same way, non-trans males did. Because I sort of like received the message, but I like reacted to that message differently. I like, for example, I didn't like that message, or like rejected that message, or I sort of, you know, yeah. So you have like a non-typical response to the same socialized message. It's like, well, that isn't, so therefore I wasn't socialized as a male. And I would say like, you were socialized as a male, because that's sort of like definitionally like, it's just like,
That's what
it, it,
happened.
it, it yeah, it's like an unmarried uh bachelor. That's sort of just like what bachelor means, is an unmarried man. So like, male socialization just means all the ways that males are socialized different from females.
Yeah.
And regardless of how you like internalize or react to that socialization, you still receive that message in a way that's different.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can be one of these like highly effeminate homosexual males who, yeah, like doesn't act like any other typical male. It doesn't mean you don't have male socialization,
Yeah.
because you'll never experience social pressures due to going through puberty as a female, for example.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I try, like on my channel, I try and be as clear as I can, sort of where I don't have that kind of female growing up experience. Because there's loads of things that I've never experienced and never will, because I didn't grow up like a girl. You know, like you
Yeah.
get the stereotype of like builders like wolf whistling at you when you're walking home from school and stuff. Like, I'll never know what that's like, and it can't be pleasant, you know?
Right. Yeah. And I think, this is tricky because it's like, well, you know, there are some trans women who are extremely stealth, pass very, very well. And so they sort of are perceived to be female by society, and like, 95% of their social existence. So say like, well, yeah, they're experiencing, this female socialization, they're experiencing misogyny, they're experiencing these things, that are purported to be part of the female experience. Like, someone was like mansplaining to me, or someone was catcalling me, or, I was, experienced the male gaze or something like this. But I think we can account for that by saying that, like, if you mimic a category, or you imitate a category very very well, yeah, you can experience like a degree of overlap in that experience without exhausting that experience. But we don't want to
Yeah.
say that like the overlap is what's definitive versus like the thing itself being female. And like you can imitate being female really really well and like sort of experience that, but it's sort of like, I would, on the flip side, I would say like a male who imitates femaleness very very well, is it misogyny, or is it experiencing discrimination on the basis of like being a very gender not conforming male or something? I don't know. It's sort of like
Yeah.
philosophically, it's like, it's kind of like it's a difference that doesn't really make a difference.
Yeah, there's a lot of jumping to conclusions with like the misogyny thing. I don't even think, like, I can hear it when people, I probably kind of said something like this similar already, but like I can hear it when someone's clearly like going off of stereotypes, or it sounds like they watch porn and that's where a lot of this comes from. But like, people want to generalize it, it feels like, to any kind of cross-dressing sometimes. And it does make me worry if like the TERF side is kind of similar to the TRA side in a way, that they almost want to enforce like no real gender nonconformity. Because if you're gender nonconforming on the trans side, you're the other sex. And if you're gender nonconforming on the TERF side, it feels like you're trying to be trans, and that's like not good, I guess.
So, so you're saying like, if you were from like the more turf position, you're being like, let's say you're male and you're being extremely gender not conforming, going down, let's say, a transition pathway, like you're saying they're not going to allow that type of gender not conforming because
Well, it
it's too
feels
much.
like if I was just a guy and I looked exactly the same, would I potentially still get transphobia anyway, even if I was like, I'm just a guy, I just wear these clothes and have long hair? Like, I worry that I'd get the same kind of transphobia, because that was honestly one of the parts that made me transition, was feminizing myself to the point where people just thought I was trans anyway.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's the sort of thing. It's like, we've sort of developed a stereotype of what a trans woman looks like. And so now that the public is like aware of like that stereotype, like, if someone looked, let's say you had a twin who looked identically to you, but for whatever reason they didn't identify as trans, they just said, I'm just a gender not conforming man. Like, walking into Starbucks, like most people are going to think that's like a trans woman, because that's sort
Yeah.
of, we've just come to expect that. So yeah, I think we've are losing our grip on that category of a gender non-conforming man, even though you will hear the TRA sort of say, when they're doing their sort of like inclusive diversity umbrella type, posturing, it's like, oh yeah, like we support drag queens and gender nonconformity and trans people, and they sort of like, they say they support gender nonconformity, but theoretically they also want people to assume pronouns in certain in like social scripts. I've seen like a number of trans women sort of push back on like they theming trans women. They'll say like, oh yeah, well, you should just assume that everyone who looks like a trans woman or looks trans feminine to some degree uses she her pronouns, because being they them'd as a binary trans woman is too triggering or whatever. It's sort of like they, yeah, I don't know. It's almost like it's like a weird
I know what
sort
you
of
mean. Like, I'm
like
in two
the,
minds with it because, like, the, maybe I'm just bad at remembering pronouns and stuff like that. But I find the only real way to try and not offend anyone is to just call everyone they. You know what I mean? Like, if they look like a gender
right,
person, just assume they're a they. Like, I would rather people assume that I was a she, but I'm past the point of really caring if people call me the wrong thing. But, like,
right.
I don't know. It feels like they created the conditions for that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's tricky. I mean, like, I think ideally if I sort of was a philosopher king and just like waved my magic wand and like, impose my gender ideology on the populace, I would just simplify things. But in a way, you can't ever really do that just because the trans population presents to such a degree of variety where,
Yeah.
you have degrees of possibility and, sort of you can't just wave a magic wand and like expect one answer. It's just like, oh yeah, we're everyone who looks and sounds like this, we're going to use this one social script, and everyone who looks and sounds like this, we're going to use this other social script, because inevitably there's going to be counterexamples. And it's whenever you're trying to figure out pragmatically how to deal with the counterexamples, these edge cases, that's where the rubber meets the road with like social policy and the reality of like transsexualism.
Yeah.
And then the question is like, okay, well, even if you banned transsexualism, like there's still millions of people who have medically transitioned to these large degrees. So it's like, how do they integrate into the society? And there's not really a good answer.
Yeah. I mean,
um,
what I found, I kind of went through a whole arc, and my kind of positions have moved very slowly, very slightly right of where I was, if that makes sense. And like, I started off for a while, like arguing with like TERFs on like Twitter and stuff. And overwhelmingly, it felt like they want to make all these like prescriptions for society. But then you sort of say, well, there's still these people that are here that kind of need help in some way or another, like trans people. It's like they just want to disregard them. It's like those people aren't even human to them,
yeah.
if you know what I
I
mean.
mean, I think yeah, I mean, there's sort of a tendency to stick to the realm of like idealism. And I think that's where a lot of like the conversation happens of like debating our utopia ideal society. And, the TERFs sort of have their own utopian vision of,
Yeah.
it's a perfectly sex segregated society. Um, and like everyone is in like one of two boxes, and all legal and social and pragmatic, facilities, and it's all perfectly sex segregated with no exceptions, and we just sort of figure out how to make that work. Even
So the
though,
men come out once a year to breed and then go back in their prisons, I
right.
guess. I don't know. I'm joking.
Yeah. And and then people are sort of examples of like, well, what about, um trans identified females who have been on testosterone for 20 years, and then now we get into questions like you have to put like, biology scanners on the doors. And I think, that now we just have to get into like the specific, boring, concrete, practical realities of each particular social situation, which will have different answers. So, like the pragmatics of bathrooms, for example, a public bathroom. Let's say it's like a sports stadium, like a public sports stadium bathroom. Like the pragmatics there and the social solution there are totally different than a female prison and dealing with like sex offenders who identify as women after they were convicted. I mean, so
Yeah.
it's like, or so it's, and it just say that the same solution applies to both cases. I mean, it's like we have to drill down into the specifics. And I think what I hear the turf saying, what these, these women are saying, they're like, we just want to like establish like the principle that there is like a difference that matters here in certain cases. Whereas I
Yeah.
think the transactionists, they don't want to even grant that point in the most extreme cases, like the prison case. They'll just want to take the ideological answer to the most extreme and apply it in every extreme situation, because they say, well, if you cede any ground, for example, on the sports issue, you cede any ground on the sports thing, they'll feel like our whole political enterprise, garnering, rights for ourselves as transsexuals, it's going to go out the window and somehow, but they don't want to compromise in anything.
Do you think that's backfired?
Oh yes, I think so.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, I don't think it's backfired to the degree that some on the right have said. Like, I don't
Yeah.
think it's backfired to the point where we're going to sort of, yeah, I mean, I think the pendulum has swung back a little bit, but I still think
It's got a way to go.
most people are still in that sort of like liberal live and let live, sort of thing. And, but yeah, I think, and I think most people don't care because, like, you don't, in like the real world, you don't run into like trans people that often.
No. It's those one of those unique kind of really small in terms of the actual effect on the world it has cases that's just got massive amounts of like media coverage. It's like the
Right.
worst combination,
Right. When I was like trans identified, like one of the things that I always thought that was frustrating about that experience was sometimes I was just like lonely because I'd be like the only one at like a work function of like 100 people. I'm like the only trans person there. so yeah, I mean, I definitely think like in that and like that sense, the like pendulum is not going to swing so far so that we're going to go back to like pre 90s,
Yeah.
like, or anything like that. I think we're going to be in this, yeah, more like liberal, inclusive world. But yeah, I think with some of the sports stuff, like we've seen like what's the name? Like the Young Turks people, like there's like that pushback with
Oh,
them.
Anna
And
Kasparian.
yeah,
Yeah.
her and like the Chank or
Oh,
Chank,
Cenk Uygur.
yeah,
I can't
like
remember.
yeah, like he was pushing back on like the sports thing. So I think like on some of these topics, like that's where I think the wedge gets inserted, is like where there's consensus and common sense, and then like as soon as the trans agenda violates that like consensus, that's when people like but I think right now we're at the point where like we're working at the norms in society, like how much you can push back on certain things while still maintaining your like status within your social circle. Just for example, like dating. Like I think people underestimate the degree to which a lot of people's opinions on these sorts of topics are determined based on people's desires to stay within good standing within the dating circles that they're trying to operate in.
Yeah.
Which is why like people in the progressive world on their dating profiles, at the bottom of their profiles, they put in like BLM, ACAB,
Oh my God,
Free
yeah.
Palestine, no turfs, no swerves. They like put in like all the requisite like statements because
Yeah, it's like a signal to each other.
yeah,
And it's
so it's all
interesting
this
that it's
like
all like white queer people like putting BLM on there. It's been a
right.
while since BLM has had a big kind of thing, so it's interesting seeing it moonlight on like dating profiles of white queer people.
Oh yeah. So it's like so I think we can't underestimate that like social element to all this in terms of like a lot of it's not about like debates and arguments and stuff
Yeah.
like that. It's like a social virtue signaling. It's like how do we get moral status in our in groups to say like, I'm a moral person and I, am in the right social standing or whatever.
Yeah, it kind of feels like a lot of people, all they have to do is say what trans people want to hear, and that's literally it. Like, just be nice to a trans person, and then you're in. It kind of feels.
Yeah. And I think part of it is like, I mean, I don't know. I think there's a wide variety of reasons why the trans population has gained its social cachet. I think it's like tempting for people on like the more right wing side of things or the more like turfy side of things too, to like develop these like elaborate conspiracy theories about like they're very like top down conspiracy theories about like, the insurance industry or these like billionaire AGPs or like like the Plitzker family, Pritzker, I think,
I'm not
is
sure.
like, yeah, it was like some political dynasty here in the US, and one of them is like a billionaire AGP who's like funded a lot of like trans activism and
Are they like
stuff.
a
And
Soros kind of figure, I guess?
yeah, it's like definitely like a Soros, I think it's like the one of them, like the trans woman's like brother or cousin or something is like the governor of Illinois, like, or was
Oh,
like
wow.
Governor Pritzker. And so yeah, it's like a pharmaceutical money. And so I mean, the long story short is like pe- people in the turf world say like follow the money, and they develop these like big conspiracy theories about how the modern transgender movement is like a transhumanist medical conspiracy purely driven by top-down activist billionaires. I
Yeah.
mean, there's like definitely some like things that are alarming about some of these things, but like I think it's very tempting to sort of come up with this like grand narrative of like why we're all obsessed with like trans stuff. like
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, it sells. I mean, you've got all these
yeah,
ridiculous looking men wearing all sorts of stuff. You slap that on the front of your paper, you're probably going to sell a lot of them, you know?
yeah. Well,
Sometimes it's that
I
simple, I
mean,
think.
I have plenty of criticisms of like Julia Serrano, but one concept from her book Whipping Girl I do think actually is like true is she talked about this phenomenon called ephimophobia, which is like this irrational, oversized reaction that society has to like the phenomenon of like males feminizing themselves.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
there's just it was like Jerry Springer, like it's just there's something about that like process of a male feminizing themselves that is like sensational, or it's like it's just like you don't see, and there's like an asymmetry such that the female masculizing themselves doesn't quite garner their same sensation in the
Yeah.
media or like culturally, or like it doesn't register the same like emotional visceral response, I think, too, which is the same thing with like like a lot of guys love lesbians, but like two guys kissing like gives them the ick factor or something. I think it's like a similar sort of like um thing.
Do you think it's
um
ever like fear of being gay?
I think that's like
Yeah.
99% of it, and that taboo, and that like and the fact that like um and that like fear of being gay, I think that that taboo drives like most of why trans porn is so popular. I think is
Yeah.
because of I mean, this goes back to Freud. Like, Freud thought that like what is taboo in society um, is responsible for developing like sexual neurosis, which is essentially what a paraphilia is. And so all these men who have these kinks for you know trans women, I think that's there's something with like taboo going on there for sure.
I know what you mean, yeah. But yeah,
But
yeah, sorry.
yeah, so I mean, going back to I think the original topic of our video,
Hmm.
we've kind of gone all over the place.
Yeah,
Was there anything
I'm
else
terrible
like
for that. I do apologize. To be
no,
honest,
that's okay.
I only really have so many criticisms of AGP, so it's kind of,
Yeah.
I didn't
Well,
know
that
how long
was
I'd be
what
able to keep on that subject anyway.
that was one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you is
Yeah,
because you you know had some reasonable criticisms of Blanchardism, but you don't seem to be one of the trans women who is like totally rejected like the vocabulary or the sort of more fundamental idea that it's like a valid theoretical construct or that it
yeah,
exists. It seems like you're more like willing to admit that there's something going on here with this and there's some degree of like truth,
yeah. I
but
definitely
yeah,
see some of
and
it around. Yeah,
yeah, and I think voices like that are like needed because I think it's very tempting for Blanchardians to just kind of like not engage with any critiques, but just
yeah.
because I feel like most of the critiques are just either bad faith or they're based on ignorance or they're based on misrepresentation of the
Yeah,
theory
I mean,
or
we
they're
see
based
lots
on
of that.
like
Yeah, I
pure
watched,
like emotion. Oh,
what
go
was it?
ahead.
I watched that Amethysta person, and I watched a
Oh
bit of your
yeah,
reaction just to kind of cap it off. But she like completely the way she described it was like a man really wanting a vagina or something. I'm
right.
like, surely you must know that you're like butchering it that badly. Like, surely,
Right.
you know,
Well, I think that is one of the ways that the idea that this is pseudoscience, that it's poor science, that it's some fringe theory, that perception has persisted for so long, mostly because it's been so badly caricatured.
yeah,
um, and when you sort of straw man it, yeah, it's very easy for it to sound like a ridiculous theory because you're saying like, oh, like you're reducing all of humanity and the complexity of an individual to like this like one explanatory principle when in reality and I think there's sort of this like conflation of the complexity of motivations in any given individual life story, which like yeah, like every individual human as a case study is going to have a near infinite number of things that are influencing them to do the things they do because every human is incredibly complicated. But when you sort of zoom out and look at like the entire population and like patterns across things, I think it's a lot easier to sort of see that pattern when you zoom out versus like the individual question is like, is this individual person like, are they AGP or not? I think on
yeah,
that question it's only one of those things where like you have to recognize it and like see it in your own life and then like say like, yes, this like describes me.
yeah,
And I think that the more and more stories we see, like for example on like Phil Illy's channel, like he's been doing all these interviews where he and he's and once you start to understand that there's it comes in a wide variety of different manifestations. Not everyone's like the sissy transvestic fetishist or whatever. That's like only one way in which it like manifests. And so yeah, I think that's how like the tide is going to turn and people will start to like identify this. And it has to be just destigmatized because that's the other thing is I don't like going back to that like comment before. That person was like, oh, why do you want to destigmatize this? And this is trying to stigmatize fetishism and that's misogynistic and we gotta safeguard against the children. Why are you trying to it's like if you truly care about safeguarding and you truly care about like preventing more trans widows or preventing AGPs who ought not to transition, or maybe it's best for them in society to not transition. Self knowledge is probably like the best thing to like cause people to like put up some roadblocks before they go down the
Yeah.
transition pathway, and like no one's going to understand themselves with this theory unless it's like stigmatized.
Yeah.
Because like so if these turfs like want AGPs to like gain some self-awareness and start acting more appropriately in these different social contexts, like destigmatizing the theory that explains their own behavior is like key to that process. And it's something Phil's been saying for like forever now. And I
Yeah.
totally think he's right about that. And the turfs are totally, it's like good for short term like turf awareness or whatever to like, highlight all these cases. And there's like some legitimate like safeguarding concerns with, some of this stuff, like some of these egregious examples we've seen with like prisons and things like that. Stuff like the like Redux Mag publishes a lot about all these
Yeah.
AGPs got gone bad, but yeah. So that's sort of my thought.
Yeah. Do you think there's very much merit to like the gender identity kind of theory, the conventional theory, I guess?
I mean, it depends on what we mean by like the theory. I mean, if we say that like gender identity is like innate and inborn, is this like innate essence of who we are as humans, just like our race, our age, our sex, our nationality, sort of like these protected characteristics that are so like, that's like sort of like the whole theory of like gender identity as a protected human right characteristic is it's like just as immutable and innate as like your race or your sex. And I feel like that as like that theory is like dead in the water. It's sort of like, you're sort of born with these gender identities and you have to like respect them, and that gender identity we're born with is like the ultimate explanation for like where gender dysphoria comes from. But I don't think there's merit to the theory insofar as like gender identity is like a real thing that exists, because I do think we have identities.
Yeah. And gender is a part of
And
that, surely.
yeah, and like, so yeah, so I think the question is like, how do these identities develop over time, psychologically? And like, I think that's, and yeah, like there's different models for how that happens. So like the
Your
gender identity for
interchange.
like an adolescent teenage female with little to no body dysmorphia and autism and the history of sexual trauma, like how that gender identity develops is going to be very, very different from how the gender identity of like incredibly autoandrophobic AGP male who like has like anatomical AGP and wants a vagina. Like, like that, those two gender identities, it's like not even the same universe. It's like apples and oranges. We just call them the same thing, gender identity, but the
Yeah.
psychological process involved in the two things, like it's totally different in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I've grown to be very skeptical of the kind of gender identity model. I don't even know what it means to have like a specific gender identity. Like, I have no idea what it means to identify as a woman. To me, I just feel like I have gender dysphoria, which isn't like the root cause, it's the symptom, which is fair enough. I understand that. But I feel like to identify as something is like an action. And it's almost like people want to be able to opt into like a protected class sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a tempting thing to do, both for males and females. And I've heard a number of like critiques of this theory of like saying like, oh well, like everyone knows that the LGBT community experiences all this discrimination and bigotry, so why would a teenager ever want to opt into a social class to make their lives harder, and to face all this discrimination? I think it's severely misunderstanding youth psychology to think that there's no social incentive for a young person to identify into a class that is marginalized.
Yeah, it depends what circle
Because
you're in. Like loads of stuff.
right, because yeah, at school maybe the queer kids do get ostracized. Like maybe like the LGBT clique is not the jocks, they're not the cool kids, they're not the coolest kids at school, and maybe they get beat up or made fun of or something. But within the LGBT community, like there is a social hierarchy, and also there's community and belonging and meaning and purpose, and getting along with people who are like-minded and alternative and different, and these are like the kind of like the emo and the alternative and the goth kids, and the like neurodivergent kids, and you want to be in like that group of that club, that those kids seem cool because maybe you like their fashion or you like their memes, or they seem like they have a good. So yeah, so I think to like say that there's no incentive to like identify
Yeah.
into an oppressed group, when you identify as oppressed, you get immediately plugged into a political struggle. You go to pride events, and now your life has purpose and meaning because you're plugged into something larger than yourself, which is what religion and politics used to be about. That was like the function socially, is to provide social cohesion and to provide a social narrative so that people can get plugged into a sense of meaning and purpose. So yeah, so to me, the incentives are clear.
Yeah, same. Like, I can't believe people don't. I mean, I can believe people don't think of stuff like that because it seems advantageous to say people can't possibly want to be trans. They have to feel it within themselves or something. But like, it should be undeniable. I mean, I've met people that were cisgender, and then all of a sudden, when it got trendy, they're like identifying as non-binary and therefore trans. And it's like, now apparently I'm trans, and so is this person who has changed nothing about themselves and isn't going to,
Right.
and is just a woman going by he, they pronouns.
Right.
I always find
Yeah.
that strange.
When like you start having like people within these like the university world or the NGO world or like the corporate DEI world, and they sort of like that female who just puts the she they and otherwise is like totally non-dysphoric and dresses feminine, and yeah, it's like at that point like we're dealing with virtue signaling and social justice and a sort of an ideological feminist rejection of like yeah, it's like supposed to be like a statement of like fighting the gender binary, and the gender binary is connected to cis heteronormative patriarchy, white supremacy, and so to fight the gender non-binary, you sort of fight the patriarchal expectations of the gender system, and to fight that you sort of reject the binary, and to reject the binary you sort of you are they them or something. So
Yeah.
it's like so yeah, I mean I like I've known people like this. I've like dated people like this who
Yeah. Did you know a
so
lot
yeah,
more
it's
like trans people when you were trans, or not so much?
not so much. I mean I know of them. I mean I'm like still Facebook friends with like half the trans community here in
Yeah.
my hometown, in my local town, but I was never like that close with the local trans community. Like after the first couple years where I was like plugged into like local support groups and stuff, like I kind of, just lived my life. I was more so like just like online discourse and stuff. But yeah, I was never like super involved in like the local trans scene here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I need
So
to try and get more experiences from people because I've always been like very apart from all that kind of stuff. Like communities and stuff I just haven't really had, and I've kind of done stuff on my own, and like the friends I make are usually just kind of guys or like women or whatever.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
it seems like from the videos that you've been making, like it's sort of like you're like pushback to like modern gender ideology. It seems like you're not making a lot of friends in the trans community, probably.
No, I
Like,
mean, like I used to try, and for years I like kind of played the game, and like I'd see all this different stuff that friends of mine that were trans would post and think that this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life, but I won't say anything because, I can accept people having different opinions to me on stuff, But then, like, whenever I voiced any kind of opinion about trans stuff, it was like suddenly that was beyond the pale. It got really frustrating. I don't know. So like
Yeah,
this is like built over years and years. Like when I started my channel, it's because I was like completely broken by all this shit, you know. So it's kind of the
yeah.
vitriol was kind of building up for a long time, and I do need to try and scale it back a bit. I think I don't want to be the AVGN in every video, you know. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. It's very seat of my pants kind of thing. So
Yeah, well, it's good. I think it's it's good to have alternative voices, even though I think historically those voices have been like totally suppressed within the
yeah,
trans community to the point of like not being platformed at all, or just you couldn't even share these opinions on like Twitter until Elon bought it. You'd
yeah,
get instantly banned off of like Twitter for even talking about half the things we talked about today would
yeah. It's
get you like
crazy.
would like violate community guidelines
Yeah.
for like Twitter until very recently. So people like forget that, and
Like, what groups does that work for apart from trans, you know? Like, we have a lot of special privilege when we think about it.
yeah, for sure. Well, I think that was pretty much all I wanted to talk about
Yeah.
with the two types of transgender. I think we covered like various aspects of
Yeah.
you know ventured pretty well. I'm actually gonna get some lunch because I have not eaten anything
Oh, fair
today.
enough. Yeah. Don't let me stop you.
So
I can usually stick around for as short or as long as needed. So
yeah, so okay. Well, this has been nice.
yeah, good talking to you.
Thanks for chatting, and
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
maybe we should do this again sometime.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, just drop me a message. Whenever, really. I don't know.
Okay.
Cool.
All
All right.
right.
Have a good one.
See you.
Bye.
All right. Bye.